Okay, so what I have in front of me is a map, and I posted this map on Blackboard. And as I've said a number of times, the reason, really, the underlying cause of the Civil War was the question over the whether or not slavery would expand, especially in the new territory the U.S. Purchased from Louisiana in 1803 or captured from Mexico in 1848. If the U.S. had stayed a country that existed just east of the Mississippi River, it's very unclear if there had been a civil war. Most white Northerners could live with slavery very comfortably. And also, many whites in the North were making a lot of money off slavery, especially those working in the textile mills. Of course, the owners of the textile mills were making the most money. But you had shipping from New York. Places like New York offered Southerners insurance. They offered them shipping. They offered them loans. So you had an integrated economy. But what happens is the U.S. expands all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and the fights over whether or not this territory that was captured, first purchased from France and then captured from Mexico, would be slave or free, um, are really the match that lights the fuse that leads to the Civil War. So I talked a little bit in the previous podcast about the North and South going in different directions. I did want to make one point, though, about the small farms of the North. What the northern farmers, these family farmers, what they're growing to a large extent are wheat and corn. And during the Civil War, the fact that the North is growing wheat and corn is going to offset the South's advantage in growing cotton. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. Northerners aren't growing cotton in large part because the climate just didn't lend itself to growing cotton. And if it had, there probably would have been slave in the northern states, but we'll never know. So now what I want to talk about is this. So you have these two different economies that are developing. And on top of this economic system, you have two different kinds of worldviews that develop as well. And Jacobs talks about it a little bit. But what you have in Gallagher and Waugh talk about it, what you have in the North is the development of a free labor ideology. And this is what this podcast is about, the free labor ideology. And this is something you need to know. Free labor, another way of saying it is wage labor. They're exactly the same thing. Free labor and wage labor, exactly the same thing. And what I want to get across to you in this podcast is both free labor or slash wage labor, they're coded white. They're coded for white workers. So when we're talking about free labor and wage labor, and when they talked about free labor and wage labor during this period, the folks talking about that, the folks celebrating that, and arguing that this was the best mode for society. What's unsaid, but it doesn't have to be said because everyone understands it. Who these folks are talking about? They're talking about white workers. No one was talking about African Americans when they talk about free labor, because something like maybe only 2% of the population of the northern states was African American. Something incredible like that, at most 5%, but I think even less than that. African Americans lived in the South before 1860. So in opposing the expansion of slavery, one of the points I want to get across is whites were also didn't want African Americans to move into areas of the United States where they had not lived before. I can't stress to you the racism of the vast majority of Northern whites, how powerful it was. They didn't own slaves, but they were deeply racist. The vast majority of them were. Okay, so this free labor ideology, and that's just what I'm going to call it now, it coded white. It it respects and valorizes the dignity of work and argues that anybody that has self-discipline and who works hard would have an opportunity for upward mobility, for a decent living, and social advancement. And of course, we know that's not true. We know that, I mean, it's not 100% true. We know that there wasn't upward mobility for everyone. We know that many factory workers lived in horrendous conditions. There was no social safety net whatsoever for these factory workers. This is what's called wage slavery. And Southern whites would say, hey, look, our slaves have it better than yours because we take care of our slaves and you don't take care of your workers. Okay, well, the white workers have mobility. They can come and go as they please. Their children aren't stolen from them, aren't separated from them. Their wives aren't constantly subject, or their women aren't constantly subject to sexual assault. So anyway, I probably don't have to really argue to you that the wage slavery argument doesn't hold much water. But nonetheless, it was an argument that slaveholders made. And what's interesting about this is a quick digression. Um, uh, Large whites that owned large numbers of slaves made the most powerful critique against American capitalism that any powerful group in the history of the United States has ever made. It's kind of ironic. So the slaveholding class, when it looked to northern cities, they critiqued the negative side of capitalism, and these folks ran Washington. Every president, except for the two Adams, had been either a slaveholder or pro-slavery from the writing of the Constitution to 1860. Two-thirds of the Supreme Court between the writing of the Constitution and 1860 owned slaves. James K. Polk, the president of the United States, he bought and sold slaves from the White House. So it's interesting that you've got this very powerful group of wealthy Americans, wealthy and powerful Americans critiquing capitalism, but of course the problem is they're critiquing capitalism to defend slavery, so it loses a lot of its punch there. So, and then I do want to say that, of course, there's upward mobility in the United States. Look at Abraham Lincoln. He is the classic example, born in a log cabin, becomes president of the United States. So there was truth in the social mobility ethos of the free labor system. It wasn't all just smoke and mirrors. So what happens is, though, that Northern whites, what they want to do is they want to preserve the territory, the Louisiana territory, north, especially north of the Missouri Compromise line. And then later on, beginning in 1848, the territory captured from Mexico, the vast majority of it, especially California. They want to protect this territory, and they want to monopolize it with free labor. Okay, they don't want slave labor to go into especially the new territory captured from Mexico in 1848, but also they want to keep as much as the Louisiana Purchase territory monopolized for free labor as well. As this territory I'm talking about, if you look at the map, we're talking about Montana, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Kansas, that area as well. And they believed that the Missouri Compromise line had guaranteed that this area, this northern area of Louisiana Purchase, guaranteed the sanctity of free labor in the territory above the Missouri Compromise line. But as you'll learn later in this podcast, that wasn't the case. So this is where the belief, the ideology of free labor intersects with the strong desire, the fierce desire of Northern whites to stop the expansion of slavery into as much new territory as possible. So this is where the two intersect, because what Northern whites want to do is they want to protect the new territory, the Louisiana Purchase territory, and also the territory captured from Mexico in 1848, especially California. They want to protect this territory for free labor. They do not want slave labor to go into this territory because wage labor or free labor can't compete with slave labor because slaves don't get paid. Okay, so free laborers, wage laborers, they if slavery were to take over California, wage workers, coded white workers, would not be able to compete with slave labor because slave laborers get no salary. They don't get paid anything. Wage labor can't compete with slave labor, right? I think it's intuitively makes sense. The other thing is that whites in places like California, newly acquired territories such as California, they were deeply racist and they didn't want any African Americans in this new territory, slave or free. They wanted to reserve these territories exclusively for white people. Okay, so what you have is this seeming paradox where many Northern whites were deeply racist towards African Americans, but at the same time, they didn't like slavery either. And what I want you to get across in this podcast is both things can be true. You can be anti-slavery, and also you can dislike African Americans, individual African Americans. And as I said, most Northern whites, including Abraham Lincoln, would have allowed slavery to exist in the states where it existed, including Texas, which came into the Union in 1845. Who knows for how long? But where they drew the line was the expansion of slavery in the new territory captured from Mexico and in the northern reaches of the Louisiana Purchase territory as well. So, yeah, get that seeming paradox in your head that you could be anti-slavery, you could be against the institution of slavery, as were many Northern whites, and yet you could still be deeply, deeply racist. Now, you did have a radical group in the North, abolitionists, who were deeply anti-slavery and who had a lot of sympathy for the enslaved African Americans. But they were a despised minority for the most part. They were seen as highly radical, as extremely radical, and even dangerous because they were willing to go to war against the South to end slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, he would leading abolitionist, he would get up and he would tear up the Constitution because slavery was protected in the Constitution. But what you have to realize is it was only a minority of Northern whites who were abolitionists. Most whites, Northern whites, when they looked at abolitionists, saw them as quite dangerous. And actually, some abolitionists were hung, were murdered by other whites. So what I'll leave you with this: the free slavery ideology intersects with the desire of Northern whites to stop the expansion of slavery into new territory, because whites want to preserve this territory for free labor, and whites also want to reserve this territory for other whites. They don't want African Americans in this territory, whether they're slave or free.